Thanks for joining us on the Robo Podcast. This is a listener request. If you have a request for a show, email us and we'll do one for you.
Welcome.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a figure from English history who's, well, pretty universally panned, King John.
Yeah, bad King John. We've taken a stack of articles and research you sent over, digging into his life, his reign, and that rather notorious legacy.
Right. And our mission here is to go beyond just the simple bad king label. Can we unpack a story that's actually far more complex and, frankly, incredibly dramatic?
Oh, absolutely. It's a story full of twists.
We're going to respect the historical facts, the source material, naturally. But let's be real, King John's life was a wild ride. We'll explore losing massive chunks of territory in France,
A huge deal.
a jaw-dropping conflict with the Pope,
You can't make this stuff up.
and the unlikely origins of a document that became, incredibly famous, the Magna Carta. Get ready for some surprising facts.
Maybe a few laughs, too, amidst the seriousness. So let's jump in. The beginning of this roller coaster. We know him as King John, often nicknamed Lackland. But where did that even come from?
Right. It sounds straightforward, like he had no land. But it's not quite that simple. He was born around 1166, youngest son of, well, arguably history's ultimate power couple, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Some serious parents.
Definitely. And our source notes that the nickname Lackland actually stemmed from Henry II's initial plan. Back in 1173, he wanted to give John, his favorite son apparently, a huge amount of land tied to a potential marriage.
Ah, so it wasn't about not having land initially.
Exactly. His older brothers, including the future Richard the Lionheart, they immediately rebelled against this idea. So Lackland wasn't about John having nothing, but this controversial plan to give him so much land that it sparked a family feud.
The irony is thick right from the start, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, this is family drama on a level Shakespeare would appreciate. Despite that rebellion, provisions were made for John later. He got the earldom of Gloucester. And in 1177, the lordship of Ireland was granted to him. He visited Ireland in 1185, and, well, the source is pretty blunt here.
Oh.
It says this visit cemented his reputation for youthful political indiscretions and reckless irresponsibility.
Early previews of coming attractions, perhaps. You could argue that.
Maybe so. And Henry II's continued favoritism towards John actually fueled Richard's rebellion in 1189. Then, for reasons the source calls obscure.
Meaning, we don't really know why.
Right. John flipped sides and deserted his father to join Richard.
Wait. So he goes from being daddy's favorite to joining the rebellious big brother against dad. Just like that.
Seems like it. Takes some nerve. So Richard becomes king in 1189, and John gets rewarded for, well, switching sides.
Rewarded how?
He gets titles, Count of Mortain, confirmed as Lord of Ireland, major lands and revenues. We're talking £6,000 a year. That's serious money back then.
Wow, okay.
He even married Isabel of Gloucester. But there was a catch.
Always a catch.
He had to promise not to enter England while Richard was off on crusade.
A promise he broke. Let me guess. Almost immediately.
You got it. Because even while Richard was away, John was already thinking about succession. Who would inherit the throne?
Right. Richard didn't have a direct heir at that point.
Nope. And Richard had actually named their nephew, Arthur I of Brittany, the young son of their deceased brother Geoffrey, as his heir in 1190. Arthur was John's main rival.
The young kid.
And John clearly wasn't okay with a 3-year-old nephew potentially getting the throne ahead of him. So he broke his oath, zipped back to England, and started, stirring the pot, leading opposition to Richard's chancellor.
Okay, classic John move starting to emerge.
Then he hears Richard's been captured. Imprisoned in Germany in 1193. What's John's move?
Oh, this is where it gets juicy, right? He allies with Richard's biggest enemy, King Philip II of France.
The King of France.
Yes. And tries to take over England himself. It didn't actually work. He had to agree to a truce, but then he immediately made further deals with Philip to basically divvy up Richard's possessions if they could.
So while Richard is literally chained up, held for ransom, his own brother is back home, cutting deals with the enemy and trying to grab the throne.
The level of political maneuvering, or maybe just outright betrayal, it's kind of stunning.
It really is. Richard eventually gets back in 1194. John is understandably banished and loses his lands.
As you'd expect.
But somehow he managed to reconcile with Richard pretty quickly. Got some lands back by 1195.
How does that even happen? Richard must have been somewhat forgiving or pragmatic.
Maybe pragmatic. His full rehabilitation, though, only came after Arthur the nephew, the rival heir, was handed over to Philip II in 1196. That finally led Richard to recognize John as his official heir.
So despite all the plotting, all the scheming, by the time Richard dies in 1199, John is actually in position to become king.
He is. The idea of representative succession, that the throne should automatically go to the son of the dead elder brother, little Arthur wasn't fully locked in yet.
Right, the rules weren't quite as clear-cut then.
So when Richard died in April 1199, John moved fast, invested as Duke of Normandy, then crowned King of England in May.
But Arthur still had backers, didn't he? Especially King Philip II of France.
Absolutely. Philip recognized Arthur as the rightful ruler in key French territories like Anjou and Maine. John had to negotiate.
Which led to the Treaty of Le Goulet in 1200.
That's the one. It essentially bought Philip's recognition of John's claim over all of Richard's French lands, but it came at a cost. John had to make significant concessions to Philip.
Okay, so he paid politically to secure his claim in France. What triggers the next round of conflict, the one that leads to him losing so much of it?
Well, that spark came from his second marriage. His first marriage had been dissolved, grounds of consanguinity, too closely related.
Okay.
And then in 1200, John steps into Poitou politics by marrying Isabella of Angoulême.
Who was already betrothed to someone else, right? Hugh the Knight de Lusignan. That sounds messy.
Extremely messy. John's politically motivated marriage completely enraged the Lusignan family. They rebelled the following year and appealed directly to, guess who?
Philip II of France. Always Philip.
Always Philip. And Philip, probably looking for any excuse to challenge John's power in France, summoned John to his court to answer for his actions. Like John was his vassal.
And John famously
Failed to show up, which gave Philip the legal justification he needed to declare John's French lands forfeit and declare war.
Right. John actually had a temporary success early on, didn't he? At Mirbeau in 1202, he captured Arthur of Brittany.
He did. That was a big moment. But what happened next is where things really fall apart for John on the continent.
This is the big loss.
Huge. Normandy was lost incredibly quickly, falling by 1204.
Wow. The ancestral homeland of the Norman kings. Gone.
Gone. Anjou, Maine, parts of Poitou, fall by 1206. The source attributes this devastating loss pretty clearly. Superior French resources compared to the strain on England and Norman resources. They just couldn't keep up.
How do you even lose that much land, that important land, in just a few years? Must have been a massive, massive blow to his reputation.
And his treasury, presumably. And it meant he essentially became King of England, primarily, residing there almost permanently now.
It was a defining moment, a real shift, and it coincided with the death of his powerful chancellor, Hubert Walter, in 1205.
Right. And the source says this led to John taking much more personal control over the government, promoting people loyal to him from his own household. More direct rule.
And his absolute determination to try and recover those lost lands. That led to something the source calls ruthlessly efficient financial administration.
Ruthlessly efficient. That sounds ominous.
It kind of was, for the people paying. He started imposing heavy taxation on revenues, conducting detailed investigations into royal forests, big sources of income, heavily taxing the Jewish population, who were under direct royal protection and thus vulnerable, launching inquiries into feudal tenures, basically checking who owed what, and generally exploiting every single feudal right he had to squeeze money out of the country.
Okay, so he needed cash for war, and he went after it hard.
Extremely hard. And this efficiency, while maybe filling the royal coffers for a potential future invasion, it provided the material basis for the later charges of tyranny leveled against him.
Right. His need for money, driven by military failure, made him extremely unpopular with those he was taxing so heavily.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle, isn't it? Lose land, need money, tax hard, become hated, less support, harder to get land back.
Exactly. And then, just to add another layer of chaos, he picks a fight with the Pope.
Oh, boy. As if things weren't complicated enough. This was a colossal distraction and another huge blow to his authority and prestige.
What kicked it off?
It all started with the election of the new Archbishop of Canterbury after Hubert Walter's death. A hugely important position. Pope Innocent III rejected John's candidate.
Who the king traditionally had a big say in choosing.
Right. And Innocent secured the election of his guy, Stephen Langton, in 1206.
But John refused to accept Langton, didn't he? He insisted on what he saw as the traditional rights of the English crown.
He did. He dug his heels in. But Pope Innocent III, Well, he did not mess around. His response was incredibly severe. In March 1208, he placed the entire Kingdom of England under an interdict.
An interdict. What did that actually mean for people living in England day to day?
It was huge. It essentially meant church services across the country stopped. No mass, no sacraments like baptisms or marriages in church, no burials in sacred ground. Imagine the psychological impact.
That's massive social disruption,
Yeah.
designed to put immense pressure on the king by alienating him from his people through their spiritual lives.
Precisely. And then, in November 1209, the Pope went even further and excommunicated John himself, personally.
So the King of England is literally cast out of the church. This is next-level drama. What did John gain from this standoff besides, spiritual isolation and massive unpopularity?
Well, financially. While the interdict was in place, John seized the revenues of vacant church positions, bishops, abbots. If they died or fled, he took the income. And he managed to amass over £100,000 this way. He was essentially profiting from the shutdown of the church.
That's a lot of money back then. But the source says this dispute severely hampered his plans to recover his continental lands. It just consumed his energy and resources domestically.
Totally. The quarrel dragged on for years. Until 1213, John finally blinked. He agreed to accept Langton and the Pope's terms in November 1212.
Okay, so he caved on the archbishop.
But then he did something even more dramatic. In a move that must have shocked everyone, in May 1213, he formally surrendered his entire kingdom to the papal nuncio, the Pope's representative at Ewell near Dover.
Wait, he gave his kingdom to the Pope, was handed over the keys, and then what?
He received it back immediately, but as a papal vassal. He acknowledged the Pope as his feudal overlord, agreeing to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks.
Wow, that's a stunning act of submission. Why? Strategically, what was the point?
It was strategically brilliant in a way. He was absolved from excommunication in July 1213. The interdict was finally lifted a year later in July 1214.
Okay, so peace with the church.
But more importantly, his primary goal was achieved: securing the papacy as a powerful international ally. This wasn't just useful against Philip II of France, but crucially against his own barons, who were becoming increasingly restless. He essentially got the ultimate authority figure in Christendom on his side.
Okay, I see the logic now. Use the Pope against your enemies, foreign and domestic. But the political cost must have been immense, surely. How is this viewed?
Oh, the monastic chroniclers, the main writers of history at the time, were furious, absolutely livid about his treatment of the church during the interdict, and probably this submission, too.
Right.
They absolutely hammered him in their writings, loaded him with charges. Tyranny, cruelty, sacrilege, irreligion. This whole dispute fundamentally shaped his negative historical reputation right from the start.
It seems like almost every major conflict John faced eventually circled back to increasing pressure from his own barons. It's a recurring theme.
Absolutely. Recurrent baronial discontent is probably the major theme of his reign, especially the later part. It really boiled over in August 1212 with the plot.
A plot? To do what?
To either murder John or desert him during a campaign he was planning against the Welsh. It was unsuccessful, but showed the depth of the anger.
And Stephen Langton, the Archbishop John, finally had to accept. Didn't he play a role related to this?
Yes, interestingly, after the plot failed and the barons involved lost papal support, Langton actually protected some of them, like Eustace de Vesci and Robert Fitzwalter. Their restoration was even part of the Pope's terms for reconciliation with John. Shows the complex web of alliances.
So Langton wasn't just a simple pawn of the Pope or John.
Not at all. John was initially quite skilled, the source says, at isolating the most troublesome barons. He even launched another attempt to recover France in 1214, landed at La Rochelle.
Did it work this time?
Nope, another failure. He achieved nothing decisive and had to settle for yet another truce with Philip.
And he returned to England in October 1214 to find what?
To find the discontent wasn't isolated anymore. It had spread significantly, particularly strong in the northern counties, East Anglia, the home counties around London. It was much broader now.
Negotiations broke down, right? And then civil war.
Pretty much. After attempts at negotiation, appeals to the Pope, who now backed John. Remember, civil war erupted in May 1215.
What was the tipping point?
What really tipped the scales was when London, the capital, the commercial heart, joined the rebels later that same month, May 1215. That made John's position pretty much untenable and forced him back to the negotiating table.
Which brings us to that famous field, Runnymede, June 15, 1215.
The iconic moment. John accepted the terms presented by the barons, which were written down in a document called the Articles of the Barons.
After some revisions, that document became the Magna Carta, accepted by the king and barons on June 19th, 1215. Now, our source is quite specific on its initial purpose. What was it really about then?
Yeah, it's important. The source is clear. It was intended primarily to ensure feudal rights and restate existing English law.
So it wasn't some, brand new constitution or a declaration of universal human rights as we might sometimes think of it today.
Not until 15, no. Based on the source, at its heart, it was a practical document rooted very much in the feudal system of the time. It aimed to curb specific abuses of royal power that the barons felt John had committed.
Especially regarding things like taxation, justice, feudal obligations.
Exactly. Things that directly affected them and other free men. It wasn't really meant to overthrow the king or invent radical new rights, but to ensure the king followed established laws and customs. It was about reining him in based on existing principles.
And despite its eventual fame, its legendary status,
Yeah.
it didn't actually bring peace at the time, did it?
Not even close. Failed almost immediately. The source says it was rendered unworkable pretty much straight away.
Why?
Two main reasons given. One, by more intransigent barons, presumably some rebels who felt it didn't go far enough or just didn't trust John. And two, crucially, by John's own actions.
What did he do?
He immediately appealed to his new best friend, Pope Innocent III, to annul it.
His papal overlord, the ally he'd secured.
Exactly. And Pope Innocent III, seeing his vassal under pressure from rebellious subjects, sided with John. He declared Magna Carta null and void, just like that.
So the ink is barely dry, and the Pope cancels it.
Pretty much. And the Civil War continued. John, now backed by papal authority, went on the offensive. He captured Rochester Castle, laid waste to the northern counties supporting the rebels.
But things got even worse for John's cause, didn't they? The barons played their trump card.
They did. They invited Prince Louis of France, King Philip II's son, to invade England and claim the throne for himself.
So now there's a French invasion backed by the rebel barons.
Yes. John continued to fight, the source says vigorously, but he died before the conflict was resolved in October 1216, amidst the chaos.
It's quite the epitaph, isn't it? The king who signed Magna Carta, he died fighting the civil war it was meant to end. After having it annulled by the Pope he became vassal to.
The sheer historical irony is pretty mind-boggling, just layers upon layers of it.
So, given all this chaos, this loss, this conflict, losing France, the Pope trauma, the Civil War, Magna Carta signed and annulled, how do we possibly sum up John's legacy? Was he just the simple villain history often paints?
Well, his reputation at the time of his death was certainly bad. Really bad.
Understandably.
And historians of the next generation, particularly those monastic chroniclers still angry about the interdict and everything else, only made it worse. They piled on. The source notes that it wasn't until the 16th century, centuries later,
when England was again clashing with Rome under Henry VIII.
right, that some writers started to recognize some of his quality, maybe seeing his fight with the Pope in a different light.
But the negative portrait sticks, doesn't it? Because of some genuinely grim accounts. Suspicious, vengeful, treacherous, those words come up.
And the source highlights specific examples that are hard to ignore. The likely murder of Arthur I of Brittany in captivity.
His own nephew.
And the horrifying, deliberate starvation of Matilda de Braus and her son in a royal prison. These are stark reminders of the cruelty attributed to him. They weren't just rumors.
Chilling. And yet, the source also presents a different side. Says he was cultured and literate.
Which complicates the simple, brutish tyrant picture significantly, doesn't it?
It really does.
His personal religion was apparently conventional, not deeply devout, perhaps, but he did make significant gifts to churches and abbeys. He chose to be buried at Worcester Cathedral, where his effigy still survives.
And he was incredibly active, apparently.
Extraordinarily active, the source says. He loved hunting, a typical royal pastime, but his readiness to travel extensively throughout England meant he had a personal knowledge of the country probably matched by few other monarchs. He wasn't remote.
And here's a surprising detail from the source that feels really significant, something we might not expect.
Go on.
He was the first king of England since the Norman conquest who could speak English.
Think about that for a second. It's nearly 150 years after 1066, after the Norman French-speaking elite took over. And the king is finally speaking the language of the majority of the people he rules.
It's a small detail, maybe, but it marks a real cultural shift, doesn't it? A move towards a more English monarchy.
Definitely. And alongside that, he apparently took a deep personal interest in the actual machinery of government, especially judicial and financial administration.
Right. Not just leaving it to ministers. The source actually credits his reign with important administrative advances.
Like what specifically?
Things like improvements at the exchequer, that's the royal treasury system, developments in the administration of justice, the legal system, the increasing use and importance of the Privy Seal and the royal household as centers of government power.
Okay, so making government more efficient, more centralized around the king.
New methods of taxation, obviously controversial but developed, military organization, and importantly, granting chartered privileges to towns which helped them grow.
So how do you reconcile all this? The king who potentially murdered his nephew and starved a mother and son, with the king who spoke English, oversaw genuine administrative advances, and apparently had, according to the source, acute political judgment.
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The absolute core of his complicated legacy. It really challenges that simple bad king label we started with.
It does, and the source points out, despite his unreliable character, his political judgment was sharp at times. And it's crucial to remember that in 1215, during that massive rebellion, not everyone rebelled.
That's a good point.
Many barons, including some very distinguished ones, actually fought on John's side. He wasn't universally deserted.
And his death in the middle of the war, it actually, maybe counterintuitively, made a compromise peace possible.
Yes. With John gone, the dynamic shifted. His young son, Henry III, succeeded him. The rebels could be restored without losing face. Prince Louis of France eventually withdrew. The crisis passed, but the events of John's reign had permanently altered the political and legal landscape of England.
So, bringing this all back to you, our listeners, why spend time on this deep dive into King John today? Why does he still matter?
Well, because his reign, I think, laid bare these fundamental tensions that echo through history and maybe even today. The struggle for power between the ruler and powerful groups within the realm.
King versus barons, then? Maybe government versus other power centers now?
Right. The relationship between the state and major institutions like the church, state versus religion, or other major societal forces.
And the profound impact of how a government chooses to raise and manage its money. Taxation and finance are always critical.
Absolutely. John's story is just such a powerful reminder that historical figures are rarely simple villains or heroes. He was clearly a mess of contradictions.
Cruel and untrustworthy. The evidence suggests yes in significant ways, but also engaged in the details of governance, politically savvy sometimes, and presiding over significant administrative evolution, even if driven by necessity.
Exactly. The bad king narrative, which was heavily influenced by those he clashed with, especially the church chroniclers, it tends to obscure the fact that the sheer adversity and conflict during his reign. It paradoxically spurred crucial developments in England's governance and its legal system.
And Magna Carta itself, born out of this specific, messy conflict. Initially, a failed peace treaty rooted in very specific feudal rights.
It became this enduring, powerful symbol of limited government and the rule of law precisely because of the tumultuous struggle it represented. Its lasting significance wasn't really in its immediate success or even its original detailed intent.
But in the enduring idea it came to represent.
Yeah,
The challenge it posed to absolute unchecked power.
I think that's right.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. How much does profound adversity, the kind King John faced, and let's be honest, often created for himself, how much does that kind of pressure paradoxically become the engine of necessary change? Does crisis force progress?
A question worth pondering, definitely. History seems to suggest it often does.
Thanks again for listening to Robo Podcast. Bless you all.